Formula One might be about to reverse one of the biggest decisions in its history. After more than a decade of hybrid engines, the sport is seriously discussing bringing back V8s, not the old ones. Something completely different. A V8 hybrid. But if that actually happens, it raises a much bigger question. Why would Formula One abandon the technology it spent billions developing? And what would this new engine actually look like? To understand why this conversation is happening, you need to look at what the sport is actually dealing with. Start with the sound. F1's Stefano Domenicali has spoken publicly about the sport's own research showing the vast majority of fans want the sound back on track. And when your own numbers are telling you that overwhelmingly, that shapes decisions. The V8 engines ran at roughly 145 decibels, peaking at the frequency range where human hearing is most sensitive. When the hybrids arrived in 2014, the volume dropped by around 11 decibels. On a logarithmic scale, that is perceived as roughly halving the loudness overnight. Lewis Hamilton has spoken about going to Spa as a kid, feeling Schumacher's car through his whole body as it came through Eau Rouge. Charles Leclerc, who has never raced a V8 in Formula One, said in 2025 that the noise is still what he misses most. Then there is the cost. Current hybrid power units are extraordinarily expensive to develop and build, running into hundreds of millions per manufacturer per year in R&D alone. And that complexity does not just cost money, it concentrates performance. Mercedes built the best package in 2014 and turned it into 8 consecutive constructors' titles. Honda came back in 2015 and spent several seasons before winning a race with their own engine. Simpler technology distributes performance more evenly. The V8 era had 4 different world champions in 4 years. The reason F1 moved to hybrids in 2014 was relevance. The wider car world was heading toward electrification. Manufacturers needed the technology in the race car to mean something to the road car. That is what justified the investment. Hybrid engines gave them that story. But in 2026, Formula One mandated 100% sustainable fuel that is carbon neutral, which means the engine architecture no longer determines the environmental outcome. A V8 on sustainable fuel has the same carbon impact as a V6 hybrid on the same fuel. The original justification for all that complexity has been answered. So Formula One management has the commercial case, the sound case, the cost case. And now the environmental argument is neutralized too. But here is where it gets complicated, because the manufacturers who build these engines have a very different view. The manufacturers pushing back are not doing it without reason. Their position makes complete sense once you understand why they are in Formula One in the first place. It is not the trophies. It is the R&D justification, the ability to go back to their board and say every pound spent in motorsport is developing technology that ends up in road cars. Without that story, hundreds of millions a year in racing is very hard to defend. For Honda, that technology is electrification. Their president said it directly. The reason they returned to Formula One for 2026 was the powertrains and the hybrid systems. Those are directly relevant to what Honda's building as a road car company right now. A V8 with a small hybrid unit does not give them that development platform. And Honda has left this sport twice in the last 20 years. That history matters. Audi built their entire Formula One program from scratch around the 2026 regulations. Every hire, every facility, every technical decision, all oriented around the advanced hybrid formula. For Audi, the hybrid is not a feature of their Formula One engine. It is the entire point of it. But something else shifted this conversation, and most coverage has missed it. Over the last year, the world changed around these manufacturers. Governments rolling back EV legislation, key markets slowing, economic pressure on automotive balance sheets that looks very different from when the 2026 regulations were written. Several manufacturers communicated this directly to the FIA. The world has changed is how more than one of them put it. And nobody wants to fund 2 engine programs at once. A turbo hybrid running through 2030 and a V8 being developed in parallel for 2031. That is an enormous financial ask at the worst possible moment. So there is a real conflict. Formula One wants the change. The manufacturers need time and a reason to stay, which is exactly why the proposal on the table is not a straight swap. It is something more specific. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Before we get to the new engine, you need to understand what it is replacing, because the proposal is designed specifically to solve the current engine's problems. The 2026 power unit is roughly half combustion, half electric. The V6 produces around 400 kilowatts of power from combustion alone, about 536 horsepower. The MG UK contributes up to 350 kilowatts of electric power on top of that, around 470 horsepower. Combined, over 1,000 horsepower total. The problem is the battery. It can only store so much, and it depletes. When it runs low, drivers have to manage their deployment, backing off on straights to harvest charge through regenerative braking. In certain conditions, the speed difference between a car with full battery and one in harvesting mode reaches 30 to 50 kilometers an hour. That is the energy starvation problem. Now, the proposal, a 2.4-liter V8, around 880 horsepower, 16,000 revolutions per minute, running on 100% sustainable fuel, and a hybrid system, but a dramatically smaller one. Instead of a 50-50 split, the proposal targets somewhere between 90-10 and 70-30 in favor of combustion. That range is still being negotiated between manufacturers, but either end of it is a completely different car to what is racing right now. The electric component becomes a boost tool rather than half the powertrain, and energy management as a lap strategy effectively disappears. Because the battery shrinks dramatically, so does the car. The current 2026 cars have a minimum weight of 768 kilograms. The 2031 target is around 650. That is roughly 118 kilograms removed. And the vast majority of it comes out of the battery and associated cooling systems. On cost, the FIA projects a reduction of 60 to 65% compared to the 2026 generation. From simpler technology, far more standardized components, particularly in the transmission, and a separate proposal to reduce the power unit cost cap by around 30% on top of that. So the spec is taking shape. But one critical detail is still being decided, and it is the one that determines whether the sound actually comes back. The proposal describes the engine as a 2.4-liter V8, with or without a turbocharger. That's still being negotiated, and it matters more than most people realize. A turbocharged engine uses exhaust pressure to spin a turbine, which forces more air into the combustion chamber, producing more power than the displacement alone could generate. But the exhaust energy being redirected through the turbo changes the sound profile significantly. The high-frequency edge that defined the V8 era gets absorbed in that process. A naturally aspirated engine breathes freely, nothing between the combustion chamber and the exhaust. At 16,000 revolutions per minute, the combustion pulses fire directly out, at the exact frequency range that produces the sound people associate with the pre-2014 era. That's not coincidence. It's the physics of how a high-revving, naturally aspirated engine works. The sound is a direct product of the architecture. Toto Wolff described the vision as naturally aspirated, high-revving, aligned with sustainable fuel, and most of the sentiment in the paddock points in that direction. But the spec is formally still open. A turbo adds power density flexibility that some manufacturers prefer, and it reduces the engineering challenge of hitting 880 horsepower without forced induction. Whether it has a turbo or not will largely define whether this engine sounds like a return, or just a different version of what already exists. That one decision shapes the entire character of the car. But either way, the racing. Three things change, and all three point in the same direction. First, the energy management battle largely goes away. The race goes back to being decided by pace, tire strategy, and racecraft, rather than battery charge. At 10% electric contribution, that variable is almost entirely removed. At 30%, it is reduced but present. Either way, it is a fundamentally different strategic picture. Second, removing around 118 kilograms from the car changes how it moves. Lighter cars are more responsive to direction changes, load the tires more cleanly, and give drivers a more direct relationship with the road. A lot of the feedback issues drivers have described with recent generations trace back to mass. That changes. Third, the cost reduction closes the development gap between teams. When no single manufacturer can build an insurmountable engine advantage, performance spreads across the grid. The V8 era had 4 different world champions in 4 years. The first decade of the hybrid era had 2. That relationship between engine cost and competitive balance is one of the most consistent patterns in this sport's history. So, is it actually happening? The current plan is 2031. The Power Unit Governance Agreement, the contract that requires a supermajority of manufacturers to approve any fundamental engine change, expires at the end of 2030. That does not mean the FIA can simply impose whatever it wants, but it does mean the dynamic shifts. Right now, manufacturers hold meaningful veto power. From 2031, those contractual veto protections expire, and the balance of power shifts slightly toward the FIA. The regulation lock-in deadline to allow enough development time is 2027 or 2028. That window is open right now. 2030 is not completely off the table. If the 2026 season raises enough concern and the manufacturers can reach their own agreement, the FIA has indicated it would consider an earlier switch. But 2031 is where the planning sits. Toto Wolff, who built Mercedes' hybrid dynasty and called the whole idea a joke in April 2025, described the V8 as the best consensus 5 months later. The F1 CEO has the data. The drivers want it. What stands in the way is one negotiation: how much electrification stays in the package, whether there is a turbocharger or not, and whether Honda, Audi, and other manufacturers can find a version of this formula they can justify to their road car divisions. Formula One spent a decade building the most advanced engines in the history of motorsport. The proposal on the table is not about throwing that away. It is about finding a version of this sport that gives back what the vast majority of people watching say they have been missing, while keeping enough technology to make it worth being here. Whether they can agree on exactly what that looks like is the story of the next 2 years.